I know I certainly am, and I expect all of you are too, really looking forward to tonight's keynote from Kevin Hassett and the conversation that he'll have with Stanford's very own Professor John Taylor. Here to help welcome them both is Charles Pohl. Charles is the chairman and chief investment officer of Dodge & Cox, one of our longtime summit sponsors. Charles earned his BA from the University of Chicago in 1980 and got his MBA there shortly after. 1 year later? 1 year later. Okay, great. And in 1984, he joined Dodge & Cox. I'm really honored that Charles is with us here tonight, and I'm very excited to have him set the stage for Kevin Hassett and John Taylor. Please join me in welcoming Charles Pohl.
Thank you, Mark. Tonight's speaker is Kevin Hassett, who's the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and the moderator will be John Taylor. John Taylor is the Mary and Robert Raymond Professor of Economics at Stanford and the George Shultz Senior Fellow in Economics at the Hoover Institution and a Senior Fellow at SIEPR. He was Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs. He's a past member of the Council of Economic Advisors. He's one of the most cited macroeconomists in the world with a 29-page list of publications, which I will not read off to you, even though I have them right here. He is the winner of way too many awards to list, and some of them are very prestigious. But I did want to highlight one that you might have missed. I wasn't aware of this. I've known John for 23 years, and I wasn't aware of this until I found it the other day. He's the winner, and he told me he's actually very proud of this one. He's the winner of the Medal of the Oriental Republic of Uruguay for his help in solving their 2002 economic crisis. And apparently this is quite a prestigious award in Uruguay. On a personal level, I have known John, as I said, for 23 years. He's a member of the Board of Trustees of the Dodge & Cox Funds. And I can tell you in every way, he is just a wonderful human being. Kevin Hassett is obviously the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Previously, he was an economist at the American Enterprise Institute since 1997. Prior to that, he was senior economist at the Federal Reserve and an associate professor at Columbia. He received his bachelor's degree from Swarthmore and his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. His predecessor as Council of Economic Advisors chairman in the Obama administration was Jason Furman. And despite being on the opposite end of the political spectrum, Furman, upon hearing of Kevin's appointment, tweeted, quote, "Kevin is an excellent pick. He is committed to research and dialogue, plus understands policy and politics." However, Kevin has not inspired praise from all corners. Last year's dinner speaker, Larry Summers, who I also had the pleasure of introducing, in an editorial on the Trump tax plan in the Washington Post, called Hassett's claims, quote, "some combination of ignorant, disingenuous, and dishonest," end quote. I don't know about the rest of you, but this makes me even more interested in hearing from tonight's speaker, Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Kevin Hassett.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction, I think. Thanks to John Taylor and Eddie Lazier and Mike Boskin and George Shultz and all the people in this place that have done so much for our country. Thanks also for the journalists present. Jim Tankersley, the New York Times, a Stanford grad. I know that you might notice that there's a lot of stress between the administration and journalism at times. But Jim is a guy who is a model professional journalist. He treats us fairly. He probably quotes our critics too much. But other than that, has become, for me, a really good friend while I'm at CEA. And I'm glad you're here tonight, Jim. Where is Jim Tankersley? So Jim being a Stanford undergrad, decided before I could come here that I had to get a tour of the area. And so we went to this place that's closing called the Oasis. Have people heard of this? And I said to him that burgers, yeah, I can do that, but a pitcher of beer before I speak in front of an audience, but that just shows what a brilliant journalist he is, right? I mean. And so we're driving back here, and I look in the rearview mirror, and I see flashing lights, and I'm saying, why is the cop pulling us over? Jim's driving me, and he knows the area. And then I look, and I notice that Jim's not wearing a seatbelt. And so as we pull over, Jim notices too, because he grabs his seatbelt and he puts it on. And then the cop comes up to the car, and he knocks on the window, and Jim rolls it down. He says, "Sir, do you know why I pulled you over?" And Jim says, "No." And he said, "Well, you weren't wearing your seatbelt." And Jim said, "Well, yeah, I was." And then the cop said, "No, you weren't. I saw you go by. You weren't wearing your seatbelt. You must have put it on." And then Jim said, "No, I got a dark coat on. It's a dark seatbelt. You just didn't notice." And then it was like a nice test of the relationship between journalism and the Trump administration. Because the cop stuck his head in the car and looked at me, and he said, "Sir, is the driver telling the truth?" At which point, I couldn't help but, my mom told me you don't lie to cops. If you do, you get in trouble. And so I told the truth. I said, "Officer, I've known Jim for many years, and the one thing I've learned is you don't disagree with him when he's been drinking." So you've heard of fake news. Well, that was fake news right there. But thank you all for coming. And I'm the chair of the council. I'm the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. I'm very honored and humbled to have that job. I've been in the position now kind of informally since June. I was confirmed in September, 81 to 16. Who's counting? I keep a list of the people who voted for me and against me on my wall. The people who voted for me, I thank them. The people who voted against me, they'll tell you this, say, "I understand that we disagree, but I hope that we can work together." And that's the attitude that I take to the CEA, because if you read the 46th Employment Act, it establishes a precious American institution, a place that is hot-wired into the White House to provide objective advice about the economic consequences of the policy decisions being made. And so many people here at Stanford have done that so ably in the past. And I can say that I take the responsibility very seriously, and I try to live up to the example of the people from Stanford that have had the job before me, especially. When I think about what's going on in the economy right now, I think that we're in a very, very interesting time in economic history, something that economists at Stanford will study for many decades. And it goes back to something that when I was doing early undergraduate econometrics was presented to me by a really brilliant econometrics professor as something that people don't think enough about. And it's something called ergodicity. It's probably a word that you don't think about and don't expect to hear from someone who's working in the White House. But ergodicity is basically just the idea that there's a data-generating process underneath it all that we can learn. And economists think that maybe there is sometimes when they're running regressions or doing things to look at the relationship between this and that. But I've always kind of wondered whether we live in a world where economics is really like physics, where there are laws of economics that we can learn that don't change over time. And if you think about the problem in economics, there are some things that as soon as we know they're true, they become not true because you can then make profits from others who believe it. And so economics is a very difficult science. And Joseph Schumpeter, back in the early 1920s, when he first started writing this, wrote about capitalism, that he thought that capitalism would be very successful, that it would deliver prosperity to Americans and to world citizens that embrace capitalism, but it was not stable. And it was not stable, interestingly, he said, because it'll be so successful that we'll all become wealthy. And as we become wealthy, writing this from the 20s, he envisioned that he actually went 50 years ahead and said 1976, I think, was the year in capitalism, socialism, and democracy. He said the problem is by 1976, we're going to be so rich because capitalism is so effective that we're all going to be sending our kids to universities. And the universities are going to be hotbeds of anti-capitalism. And the top university students are going to go to places like Jim did, the New York Times. And they're going to preach against capitalism. And he thought that capitalism wasn't stable. And I think that underneath it all, what Schumpeter was really thinking about was this idea of ergodicity. That even if we figured out the capitalism data generating process, and we modeled it well, and we really knew how it worked, then maybe it's not stable. Maybe, as Schumpeter suggested, that capitalism begets socialism, which is what he thought. And I would not accuse Democrats of socialism, but there is one candidate who called himself a socialist after all. And I could even imagine then that we economists, we could come up with a model eventually of capitalism that defines the underlying data process well, of socialism that defines the underlying data process well, but we wouldn't really necessarily know what flips between the two, what causes it, and what that process looks like. Which basically means that economics is an impossibly challenging field, as inspiring and exciting as physics could possibly be, and that there's so much that we don't know, because there's so much that changes as soon as we know it, that we should all be humble and cautious about the things that we say economics says. And so when I'm in the White House and I provide objective advice about what economists think about things, I understand the responsibility that I have, that I'm living in a world that's not necessarily ergodic, but a lot of the questions that we get are things that are easy to answer, and I'm hoping that some of those will be questions that John gives me tonight. But back to the 46 Act for a second before I sit down and John and I have a conversation. In the 46 Act, they established the council, and ever since then, there have been economic reports to the president. John got his, I think, today, and has a prop. And in the economic report, then forever and ever, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors have been providing forecasts of the economy. And as we document in the economic report, it was kind of almost always true that anyone, I know there are not a lot of economists in this room, but anyone in this room could be trained to be an economist relatively effectively or to be an economic forecaster by looking at a few economic reports and then realizing that the 10-year forecast is 3. That's what we're going to say. And so the median forecast for many, many years was that economic growth in the US is going to be 3. That was normal, right? When I was growing up, that was what we expected. Maybe it went up a little bit, maybe it went down a little bit. But I think that that question, and it's a little bit, I'm aggregating the question a little bit, but that question is the thing that I became most occupied with as I first arrived and realized that for the first time in my life, I had to put down a forecast that I believed. And it made me think back to this question of ergodicity. And so pretty much the economic report of the president has been written by people who for many, many years believed that 3% growth was about what the macroeconomy should be delivering. And there are good reasons for that. At the end of the Obama administration, my good friend, who was very helpful during my Senate confirmation, Jason Furman, wrote economic reports of the president that suggested that that's gone, that normal, that we have a new normal where we have slow growth. And so maybe the underlying data generating process had changed, certainly if you aggregate enough. But I think that we're at this historic time in economics where there are two views. There's a view that things have changed, that the data generating process that gave you 3% growth that all those economic reports that the president talked about for so many years has changed, and that we're really doomed to growth in the 2s and the 1s. And if you look at the last economic report of the president for President Obama, they said that the forecast is 2.2 over 10 years. But an alternative view, and the view that I have, and a view that's not popular with people who have the other view, and especially the politically active ones who perhaps might have been quoted in the introduction. But my view is that maybe it's not that we're in a world that's all that different from the world that we've lived in most of our lives. Maybe it's just that we've been making policy mistakes. Maybe there are things that we're doing that have been driving growth down. Now, I wrote a lot about that as I was at the American Enterprise Institute. I have a long track record laying out the policy errors that I think that the Obama administration has made. And I think that you would agree with me that the early returns suggest that the data generating process might not have changed as much as the previous administration asserted. But to dig into that thought and others, I'm now going to move over there and sit down and talk to my friend and mentor, John Taylor. Thank you.
So thank you, Kevin, and thanks for being here, and thanks for all you're doing for your public service. It's tremendous.
And you too.
Really tremendous. But you're right, I did bring your last masterpiece, the Economic Report of the President, which is issued each year. Usually, I get a note, since I was on this council, you want your copy or not? This year I got, do you want your printed copy or not? If you don't ask for your printed copy, you'll get an electronic copy, which would be okay, except this is 562 pages of wisdom, of course.
Yes.
And I said,
but
well,
I'm a careful steward of your tax dollars right there, you got to admit.
He's saving money, but a few people like me, I don't know how many, asked, I wanted a printed copy. So it came today, just in time, with a nice note from Kevin. And it has a lot of good stuff in it. And you alluded to it a little bit in your remarks, but I'd like to dig into it a little bit more. So maybe just start, Kevin, where you left off. You don't think secular stagnation is there. That's Larry Summers' term. We heard a little bit about what Larry Summers thought tonight of Charles. But you don't believe that. You think it can change. And to some extent, the reasons are in here. Mm-hmm. And I just, two are actually highlighted in the president's report, which I kind of outlines a strategy for economics. But the 2 points you mentioned, are tax reform and regulatory reform. Tax reform and regulatory reform are big changes. I've been writing positively about them myself. But what about those two things is going to change and eliminate this idea of secular stagnation, and you're going to get growth? Well, those two changes seem to be highlighted in this report. So what is it about them that's going to generate this?
Right. Yeah, thanks for the question, and also just to return to the idea that the harsh statement at the beginning that there are lots of different types in the world, but the people that I enjoy the most are the ones, at least in the academic sphere, that disagree with me. And when you become a public figure, sometimes people disagree disagreeably. But if you read Bernard Shaw, there's Professor Higgins, and then there's Colonel Pickering, and they're really good friends. And I think that the one thing that I will never do in public life is not look at criticisms of what I'm saying, because I want to try to get stuff right. And even the people who say mean things then have a paragraph after that, they might have something useful to say in that paragraph. But that's not the case for Larry Summers. And it's just that my view of what's been happening is that there are all these policies that are documented in, as you mentioned, 560-something pages in the Economic Report of the President that have been harmful to economic growth. Regulations growing rapidly. We had a tax code that made no sense. Economic theory, and indeed a lot of the analysis of people at Hoover and SIEPR shows that when you chase capital away from this country, that it's bad for the country. It's not really rocket science. And so I think that what was going on over the last 8 years is that we had an administration that was either actively or through inaction chasing capital away from this country, and that economists were making excuses for the low growth and saying, well, it's not our policies, guys, it's the Martians who are giving us secular stagnation. There's nothing we can do about it. And I point to in the economic report, I talk about this. I point to a couple of facts in particular. Let's maybe say three. One is that over the last 8 years, profits grew about as fast as they ever grow, a little more than 10% a year. Real wages, or median real wages, declined about 0.5% a year, which is really unprecedented in a time where you have profit growth like that. And so then you could ask yourself, well, why are wages not growing? And you should all take your kids aside at some point and have that talk and tell them where wages come from. Wages come from either them being more productive because they're educated or them having more capital. And so they're more productive because they've got better machines. The example I often use is I ran a lawn mowing business when I was a kid. And when I got a self-propelled mower, then my profits went up. And so in US history, one of the things that we follow with our data pretty effectively is the contribution of capital deepening to productivity growth for American workers. The contribution of capital deepening capital deepening to productivity growth for American workers in the last 4 years went negative for the first time in US history. And so the capital was all running away and wages weren't growing. And so then you could ask yourself, well, is this happening because of the Martians? Or is this happening because there's something going on? And, it didn't take a rocket scientist or a PhD economist, perhaps, to even notice that we had the highest corporate tax in the world that was designed to encourage people to locate their capital offshore. We had regulations that, by one measure that we use, were growing about 8% a year. We're doing all these things to tell people not to do their action here. And so my view is, and this is based on academic work that I've been doing since you and I first met more than 20 years ago, that if we fix the bad policies, then the capital will come back and that growth will go up and that it'll be especially good for workers. And that's something that a lot of people in the Obama administration vehemently disagreed with. But I can say that, haven't you even been shocked that here we are just a couple months in to the tax bill being passed, and already we're going on 5 million people getting more than $1,000 raise, a couple $100 billion worth of announced increases in capital investment and so on, not to mention what's going on in markets, the jobs report today. I think that the secular stagnation case never looked that convincing to me in theory, but right now the data don't look consistent with it either.
So that's the positive thing is that the report, the tax reform, more capital, regulatory reform as well.
Regulatory reform too.
Yeah. So there's other things that I think are sort of important in the buckets of policy. One which I want to ask you about, and then I'll come back to the second, but one is trade policy. It's kind of part of regulation, right? It's international regulation. Mm-hmm. And there's actually not too much discussion of it in the report. And I wanted to just ask you what you think is happening with that. And I'll just maybe give a little more background. I did watch President Trump's presentation, I think it was in the Roosevelt Room yesterday, that outlined the proposals on tariffs. And he had, on one side, he had steelworkers and union leaders, on the other side, some economic officials. And he referred to a tweet, actually. This is the days where you not only do tweets, you refer to tweets. And it wasn't his own tweet. I can ask you about that later. But this was a tweet from our local automobile manufacturer, Elon Musk. And Elon says, if I export a Tesla to China, I pay 25% tariff. China wants to export a car to the United States, they pay 2.5% tariff. Mm-hmm. 10 times, ours is 10 times higher. And my question to some extent is, that's a sort of a different way to describe the policy or the motivation for the policy. So is that part of what's going on? Is it really an effort to get China to get their 25% tariff down, or what's really going on? If you give us some context to this policy.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I think that we did write a lot about trade in the ERP, and I looked it up while you were talking.
Okay.
But it's 59 pages on trade. And I think that when I arrived in the White House, then I immediately recognized that I was going to have to spend a lot more time studying trade policy than I have in my academic career. And one of the things that I noticed early on is that trade policy is very, very far removed from what we have in our economic models. So in our economic models, if John Taylor or Taylor land and Hassett land were going to have a trade deal, then it would be a sentence, right? We would say, let's have free trade, no barriers. If you look at the deals that actually exist, then they're really, really long and very complex and filled with exclusions and exemptions and non-tariff barriers and so on that often in the past have been negotiated by not necessarily competent negotiators for the U.S. And so in the 59 pages in the economic report of the president, I think that we pretty effectively make the case that President Trump's really onto something, that we live in this really strangely asymmetric world where the U.S. has opened up its markets to everybody, but they've not opened their markets to us at quite the same level. And we've got charts and charts and charts that make the case. Elon might have even read the ERP because he was basically citing a fact from the trade chapter in the ERP that autos are a nice example. So for autos, if a European car company sells a car into the U.S., they pay a 2.5% tariff. If a U.S. car company sells a car into Europe, they pay a 10% tariff. And you can just ask yourself, well, why do we do that? We've got charts and charts that show that just about everywhere you look, there are things that make no sense, that are asymmetric, and President Trump is intent on fixing those things. I can't remember a time where we've had a conversation about trade where he hasn't emphasized that he's a free trader, but he's tired of things that just don't make sense. And I think that that's kind of a theme of the way President Trump is even outside of trade, that there's so much in the world these days that just doesn't make sense, and he's intent on fixing it.
So how do you go from that view, which is obviously those are the data, to actually changing? What is the proposal, steel and aluminum, have to do? Where do you go next? Is it USTR is going to go and say, hey, we're going to leave these unless you make these changes? Where does it? How do you need a trade agreement? What's the operational way you're going to deliver a change?
Well, I'm not a trade negotiator, and I don't think anyone would ever ask me to be. I think that that Ambassador Lighthizer is working on exactly that, but that one asset he has is that the president is really serious about this, that if people are going to act unacceptably towards us, then he's going to do something about it. And that ought to be, I mean, so I know that there have been some of the world's greatest game theorists here at Stanford, and that ought to be something that's relevant if you're modeling bargaining. Okay.
So let me ask another set of policies, which correct me if I'm wrong on the number of pages, but there aren't too many. We'll put it that way.
Check.
Well, let me tell you. So this has to do with, I think, another important part of policy, that is fiscal policy and the budget deficit itself. So some of us have been concerned as you got this great set of tax reform and regulatory reform and your articulation of the trade policy, which is very helpful. But what about the budget? I mean, you got exploding debt, you have budget deficit. This year is 30% larger than last year. It's going over $1 trillion. Where does that fit in? And how are we going to think about that aspect of policy, which is obviously very important?
Well, this is something that, as CEA chair, that my job is to provide objective advice. And I think my objective advice last year would have been that we need to fix the tax code. That we've got this tax rate that's so high that it's encouraging people to move their activity offshore. It's so bad that people were setting up subsidiaries in Ireland and transfer pricing so much of their profit to Ireland that they're posting a loss in the U.S. and then getting refunded on past taxes so that the U.S. taxpayers were paying to build factories in Ireland. And so when you have gaping wounds like that, then you can, I think, do two things. You can theorize about secular stagnation, or you can fix them. And we fixed them. But you're right that the deficit, especially in the long run, is something that's unsustainable. I'm convinced by the academic literature that suggests that if you don't do something about it, then it inevitably is a negative for growth. And that's the kind of objective advice that I'll be giving the president.
That's very helpful. So there's a whole lot of other interesting things that is in this report, and some of which we discussed today. What I was surprised about, you may not know this, those of you who have not read the 562 pages just yet, there's two beautiful charts on the opioid crisis.
Beautiful is probably the wrong word, I guess.
The charts are beautiful. The subject is just as depressing as we heard this afternoon. But how did you come to have a whole section, and the president's report himself has a long paragraph on this, and you have some proposals to deal with it. I think that's maybe a more important part of my question is, what are you proposing to do about this? It is a problem. We heard about it, but what's part of the president's policy that deals with this?
Well, as you know, John, that being at the CEA is an astonishing opportunity to have a bully pulpit to help policymakers think about priorities. And sometimes, I mean, I think the president's priorities have been right from the beginning, and they've helped us focus on topics. But some people don't, I think, understand the gravity of the situation we face in opioids. And one of the things that I found when we started analyzing it was that previous estimates of the cost to America of the opioid crisis didn't include any value of life for all the people that were dying. But if we're deciding whether we're going to build a guardrail, then we look at the cost of the guardrail, and then we think about how many lives it saves, and then we decide whether to build the guardrail. But when tens of thousands of people were dying from opioid abuse, then we weren't including that in our cost estimates. And when we did, and this was a report we put out in the fall, and that is treated in depth in the economic report, we found that in the most recent year we have data that the cost to the U.S. was about $500 billion a year because of the actual direct expenditure and the lost lives. And so it's hard to imagine really there being a bigger problem in America right now. And I think by quantifying it the way economists do, that we can hopefully help policymakers set their priorities and understand the gravity of the challenge. There's another chapter in the economic report where we did this as well, and I commend that to you, Stanford audience especially, because there's so many experts in it here. But cybersecurity is an unexpected huge cost to society as well. I know that you read about it in the media, but as we began to study it at the CEA, we found all sorts of troubles in trying to measure the impact of cyber attack on the U.S. economy. But even with what we could find, which is the things that are made public, which are probably a subset of the things that happen, we found that the costs in the most recent year were north of $100 billion a year. So imagine if we had a bunch of villages that were, on the seaside, and pirates were coming and taking away $100 billion a year, how we might respond. But for some reason, for cyber attacks, we're not responding that way. And I think that if you go through the economic report, you'll find that we've taken very seriously our charge to study not the U.S. economy of 1946, but the U.S. economy today, and to quantify the problems that policymakers should think about. And we have a chapter on tax policy, but that just happened. I think that the other things that we quantify and look at are worthy focus of policymakers this year and beyond.
So what about the policies that are suggested by the president and by the CEA on opioids?
Well, a lot of that is not public yet. There's a lot of ongoing work, and so one of the challenges when you're a public figure is that you know the set of things that you know, but you don't always know the subset of those things that are public.
It's just what's in the report. It's in here. I mean, people can read it. So leave it at that, I guess.
But I think that there are many things that work, and that one of the going back to the cause at the beginning, that there was basically, instruction to doctors to use these things as much as they want because they're not really addictive, and that we undertreat pain, and that was true both for people with private insurance and for people with public insurance. And so I think that there's a lot of stuff that we can do to stop it at the beginning. But another thing that we've noticed is that one idea about opioids that economists have thought about is that maybe it's driven by despair, and that because of the Great Recession, there are a lot of folks, which we know it's true, that had terrible job experiences and life experiences because of the Great Recession, and so that maybe the opioid crisis is being driven by despair or an increase in demand for opioids. But an alternative theory would be that it's driven by an increase in supply because there's a cheap substitute, fentanyl, and maybe it's easier to get that into the country than it used to be, and so on. And I think that there's increasing evidence that supply is the biggest factor. And so as policymakers think about what they ought to do, a lot of this is being studied right now, then supply is going to be a big part of the policy. Because again, if it was just an increase in demand, then the price of opioids would have gone up. But in fact, the price of opioids dropped drastically.
So one thing I think many people are interested in what life is like in the White House Council of Economic Advisors these days. Mm-hmm. We're talking about the substance of the policies, which I think is very important. But there's also the aura of all that's going on and the tweets and the discussions. And maybe I'd ask you a little bit about that. And I'll just do it in the way Rex Tillerson was here a month or so ago, and Condi Rice asked him about the tweeting and how that affects his job. And he mentioned, well, I don't do tweeting. I don't do social media, but I have to, watch what the president writes on tweets. And so I had the staff print out things that are related to foreign policy. But it's a more general question it's an unusual operation, historical standards. It's just maybe the nature of the technology, social media, and it certainly has its advantages. But how does it affect the operations? I've worked in the organization a couple of times, and we didn't have anything like this. It's just completely different. So how does it affect your day-to-day business, your advising process?
So I'll start by stepping back as an academic and thinking about the fact that, and I know a lot of information theorists in the 50s and 60s saw forward to a time like this, that when I was growing up, we watched Walter Cronkite. He decided what we needed to know, and maybe they were good at it, maybe they weren't, but it was hard for us to tell, right? But there wasn't really a competition for the eyeball. I think that today there is, and that in this world, the precious commodity is really the attention that everybody in this room has, and that there's a massive competition for that attention. And I think that what's happening is that in that competition for attention, that the new media are finding outlets that are remarkably impactful in a way that'll probably stick for a long time. And so not just Twitter and Facebook, but video games and so on. And I watch my kids play video games, and they're communicating with their friends in probably a way that there's probably more communication, verbal communication now because of video games between my kids and their friends than I had when I was growing up. And so in that kind of space, this new media thing, for an old timer like me is a challenge. The president is a master at somehow requiring your attention. And so in the competition for attention, that he acquires it because he says things that are meaningful to people, I guess, and interesting to people. And often, so the jobs report came out today, and it was really good, and there were some good details in it, and the president tweeted a link to a story about the jobs report. And maybe that means that a lot of people who wouldn't normally have looked at economic data did, and that's probably a good thing. If you're at a university and you teach economics, you think that anyway. But sometimes it leads to unusual things. One time...
We want to hear about those.
Yeah, I know, that's where you're going. Just the one for me is that once, and I apologize that I forget exactly which show, but it was a Fox show, I'm pretty sure, or Fox Business, that I was on being interviewed, and then while I was being interviewed, the person interviewing me mentioned that the president just tweeted. And so I think he was watching the interview and tweeted about it while I was on TV, which was probably not something that happened to you while you were.
I don't remember that. Must be fun to move markets that way. So another sort of White House question. The National Economic Council was established with President Carter, I believe. And to some extent, it was so you had an analog to the National Security Council, National Economic Council. And just a few days ago, we heard that the current director of the National Economic Council is resigning. You're going to go somewhere else. But sort of without talking about the specifics, how does that affect the Council of Economic Advisors, National Economic Council? It's kind of like there's two people with overlapping responsibilities, and maybe better just not to have the National Economic Council. Okay, so say a little bit about how this whole thing works.
No, I disagree with that.
Okay.
But that's because I saw the National Economic Council that was built and run by Gary Cohn, who's a close friend. I'm sorry to see him leave, and I think he did a masterful job. And we at the CEA worked, I think, incredibly effectively in a way that built lifelong relationships with the National Economic Council. And what Gary and I did right from the beginning is, as you know, there's a big CEA staff and a big NEC staff, and Gary recruited people that really, really knew how Washington runs. And so there might be, take Shahira Knight, who had worked in the Ways and Means Committee and then been in Washington forever, and if you wanted to know how to get a tax bill passed, then the first person in Washington you would call is Shahira Knight. And then we had public finance economists that we had recruited that had lots of insights about, well, maybe we should do this, maybe we should do that. And Shahira has insights about those things too. But what Gary and I did right from the beginning is we didn't have this sort of silo approach where if somebody on his team wants to talk to somebody on my team, then they have to send a memo to Gary and he sends it to me, and then I find the person, and we wired everybody together. And I think that it created a really positive environment with a lot of productive stuff happening, because economists, very often, what was it Reagan said, wonder why, whether something that works in practice can be made to work in theory. And the economists like that, who are matched with people who really know how to get things done in Washington, can find an adrenaline from that they never expected, because they can start to really move the needle on specific policy things. And so our energy economists, is working on things like renewable fuel standards and working with people who really know how Washington works and learning about that. And so I think that Gary had a vision for how CEA and NEC would interact that was perfect, and I expect that will continue.
So we just got another good person will be all set. So let me open it up for questions from the audience for Kevin. It's got to touch the surface on many issues. So is there a question there in the back? I see a hand over by the light. We have a mic over there? Okay, great.
Hi, my name is Alex. I'm a freshman here at Stanford University.
Hi, Alex.
First off, thank you very much for your service to this country. We need people like you to guide the direction of our economy. My question is on the tariffs and international trade. Are you afraid that, you argue that we don't have a fair balance of trade in China, and some people will agree with that statement, but are you concerned that you may take it too far and start a trade war with China? Because what happens is prices will increase, since we use a lot of goods that are manufactured in China. Prices will increase, and ultimately it will hurt consumers like us.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think it's an important time to take a deep breath and step back and look at what happened this week. which is that the president made the judgment which the American people elected him to do, that it's a national security issue that we have vibrant steel and aluminum industries in the U.S. I'm not a national security expert, but if you look at the way that that policy is evolving, then I think it's doing so in a kind of measured and targeted way that's attentive to national security issues. And I think that that's a signal of the kind of trade policy that you should expect from the administration. It's a first move, and I think that it probably surprised some people who worried for the worse about how it might be structured.
Okay, so I see a hand way in the back, and and then it's going to be right in the front. So way in the back first.
Thanks. My name is Anat Mati. I teach at the business school. I was here this afternoon, and you talked about opioids, I'm glad that there's a recognition and there's some kind of accounting for how damaging this is. But what we heard this afternoon is that these are desperation deaths that belong in the suicide department, that they have to do with all kinds of issues in the labor market, having to do with non-compete agreements, with monopsonies, with all kinds of other things that, and so the way you tell it, it's great, but what we heard this afternoon was a little bit depressing, so I wonder how to square those things. Also, you presented Twitter and other social media as competition for attention, but we do have fake news, or let's call it falsehoods, that are spread. So I wonder how you view all of those things.
Thank you for that question, and I think that you're right to emphasize that the solution to the opioid crisis is not going to be as simple to model as I think the solution to the corporate tax problem that we had. I think that the corporate tax bill did a pretty good job of moving some parameters around that are pretty easy for us to model and getting things right. But for the opioid crisis, there are going to be many, many things from law enforcement to treatment and to prescription practices that are going to have to change for us to make progress. And I think that by quantifying the opioid problem the way we did, that we've helped people understand the stakes. And so it's really kind of like a moonshot level or Manhattan level challenge to us.
Yeah, no, thank you. Right here, Ted.
Yes, you touched on it very briefly. I was looking for you to maybe drill down a little bit. This whole issue of a growing debt in the economy and what your objective advice would be to the president going forward on that.
Yes, so again, everybody knows, every economist knows that we've made promises that vastly exceed the amount of revenue that we have coming in. And every economist here would tell you that if you wait until a crisis, then as you see in places like Greece or so on, where there suddenly is a crisis, then you end up in a place where you're cutting benefits for people who are currently retired because a crisis happened, because you weren't smart. And this is a bipartisan problem. People on both parties talk about it, and it's incumbent on us to address the problem so that we don't surprise people in retirement, because we never addressed it. And that's not a contentious position for an economist. But so that's I've got a testimony before the Senate Budget Committee in a couple of weeks, and if you want more detail, then I'd be happy to email it to you if you give me your card.
So there's lots of
I won't tweet it. I've never tweeted.
lots of concern about that. So there's two questions at the same table. So.
Thank you for being very candid on your answer. I really appreciate it. I have three quick questions. One, all economists have been fighting about lowering tariffs and opening the market.
I'm sorry, they were handing me a mic while you were talking, so could you just say that again?
I say first, thank you for being candid in your answers. I really appreciate it.
You can say that one more time if you want.
Thank you. So all economists throughout history have been fighting about lowering tariffs, opening the market. And now we hear the recent decision by increasing tariff for steel. So what's your take about that, and what was your advice, a recent scenario? Secondly, what is your comments to the President Trump about cryptocurrency? And my third and last question, so President Trump will meet North Korea president end of May to negotiate the arm deal. What if they move it to talk about negotiation on economics and opening the markets? What will be your advice? Thank you.
Yeah, I apologize. I can't comment on North Korea. On cryptocurrency, I think that economists have been doing a lot of work studying cryptocurrencies. They're extremely interesting. They, I think, in the end become maybe even a challenge to the state because if you can do everything, on the Silk Road with cryptocurrency, then how are we going to collect taxes and so on? And I think that I already addressed the question about the steel stuff that happened this week.
So, Dixon?
And there's someone over here after that.
No, okay. Over here, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you again for coming tonight and for serving our country. The elephant in the room that I'd like to ask is, particularly recently with Gary Cohn leading and resigning, President Trump has a lot of experts like yourself in economics and science across all these spectrum of issues. If you're not watching Fox News, you get a sense that there's chaos, that our president isn't listening to our experts. Can you comment on that and comfort us in some way?
Yeah, of course. Absolutely the vision of the White House that I see when I watch coverage is completely inconsistent with the White House that I experience. I show up for work every day, focused on what I'm going to do that day, going to meetings with people that I like to work with, and not getting stabbed in the back. I think that I was a track athlete in college, and I ran the 400 meters. And the 400 meters is a sort of different race because you're kind of sprinting the whole way. And White House years are like dog years. They're very hard, but it's because there's really not a lot of people in the White House, and there's so many things to do, as John could tell you. I work in an environment that has a massive number of people that I didn't know before that I've grown to be very fond of and respect enormously, and that includes the president.
So actually, just to interrupt for a second, one thing that I think is quite clear is there's such differences of opinion in our country right now about what to do. And there's differences of opinion amongst economists of what to do. And I don't think I've ever seen quite an animosity or strong disagreement, say, with what you're saying or other people are saying. It's just like like the country, the world is polarized. Economists are polarized. So do you agree, or how do you deal with that?
I think that it relates back to the issue we mentioned about the revolution in the media, we're engaged in a world where there's a competition for attention. And often, like the traffic accident is the thing that, there's rubbernecking to watch the traffic accident. And so that the person whose statements are the most vitriolic or so on is kind of like the traffic accident. And I think that, I'm confident that over time we'll evolve to a better place than the one that we're in. But I don't think that it's much more than that. And I can say that Josh Rao, where are you, Josh? That he coordinated a session at the American Economic Association meetings where we talked about the tax plan, kind of just about, right when the emotions were the hottest. And nobody in that room was mean to me or hostile or, threatening. A lot of people disagreed with me, but in a way that you would expect at a seminar. And so I think that we all need to remember that the media that we're consuming are basically, that it's a competition for our attention, and the competition is often being won by the traffic accident. But that's not really what our culture is, and that's not what the economics profession is. It's still fun to go to conferences and so on.
So there's a questions back here I can't quite see.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for coming tonight and speaking. I believe in collaborative efforts and data and all the good things, and been a fan of economics since I was a young fellow and been here at Stanford since I was 16 on and off. So most of my practice is in translational medicine. I often think about leading and lagging indicators in medicine that came from my work in economics many, many decades ago. So whether it's asthma or cigarette smoking or other things, I think there's a lot of leading and lagging indicators in economics, and I worry that despite the data being very strong about this, about the diseconomies of certain environmental issues or climate change, that perhaps there hasn't been as much. I haven't read your report yet. Perhaps you discuss some of the things that are hard to measure because they're leading or lagging indicators, but they have very, very large economic consequences. Love to hear your comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Very interesting question. I think that for the economic report of the president, that the big story is that that we don't have to resign ourselves to a new normal where we have this view of America that we've lost, that we can be optimistic, that we understand that there's at least a null hypothesis under which slow growth makes sense because of bad policy, and we can fix it. And to the extent that those bad policies were not visible to people, then you could kind of call those the invisible indicators. But I think that they should have been visible, and I know that John and I were writing about them while they were happening. But for me, I think that the indicator to watch is capital spending in the U.S. And capital deepening's contribution to productivity growth. Because if those go back to normal, then the optimistic outlook that you've got your America back, that you don't have a new normal, you've got a normal, will be very likely to be true.
Thanks, Kevin.
Curious about the economic costs on some environmental things that may be that is leading. We have some leads that they're happening, and they're going to be very large costs.
I had the honor of having lunch with Secretary Schultz and a number of faculty, including John, this morning, and somebody laughed that their favorite thing in the economic report was that we have a big chapter on our deregulatory efforts, and we suggest that we could get positive growth effects from deregulation in the U.S. because regulation has grown so much. And of course, as soon as you mention deregulation, then it's natural for someone to worry because there are a lot of good regulations. And does this mean that we're going to have dirty air and dirty water and so on? And the fact that I forget which person at lunch with us mentioned it. Maybe it was,
We can't say.
Yeah, it was an off-the-record lunch. Said that it was their favorite fact. The first reading of the economic report was that we can add about 1% to GDP over the next 10 years if we can reduce the regulatory burden in the U.S. to the current burden in Germany, and that we could get 2% of GDP over the next 10 years if we could reduce it all the way to the Netherlands. And so I think that that's a kind of nice metric of the opportunity, and I think it also shows that we don't have to do things that endanger the environment to make some economic progress.
So there's a question right here, this table. Yes.
So I feel like one kind of theme of the day, starting with Dr. Rice's talk this morning, has been that of policy correction versus policy overcorrection in some capacity. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about both how the council and the administration look at priority setting among the many issues we've talked about, so opioids, tax reform, deregulation, and so on, and how when an intervention is designed and when you're reviewing it, how you kind of make sure the scope of that is as surgical and precise as you actually want it to be.
Thanks for the question. It's a really important one, and as John will tell you, the Council of Economic Advisors' role is not to set the priorities. It's to provide the analysis that helps the people who set the priorities make rational decisions. And I think that it's important to be an honest broker, to not walk in with your own priorities and then push them all the time, because then people will worry that, well, maybe you put your finger on the scale and they shouldn't trust they shouldn't trust your numbers. And so I think that we talked about how our numbers affect the priorities, but I think that the president has done a good job, a great job really, of picking the top policy priorities in the first year, especially focusing so much on tax reform.
So, any more questions? We're just about...
There's somebody back there who yelled John, and he's hidden in the
There you are.
lights.
Okay,
Yes.
sorry. Last question.
Hi, I'm a freshman here at Stanford. You said earlier that your favorite people to read are the people that disagree with you.
Mm-hmm.
What's the most valid criticism of your work in the White House that you've read?
Oh, yeah, there was a good one that... Mihir Desai and Jim Hines, two friends of mine, wrote a paper that we used a table in their paper to estimate the wage effect from their paper. But it turned out that the table had a typo in it, and that if you believed the table the way they said it, then you would get our number. But what the number actually was a different number, and then Mihir remembered it that way and said that the number that we put in our report was different from the number that you would get if you did the analysis correctly. And our people went back and traced why we got it wrong, and we just basically decided, since in the end Mihir and Jim's paper, which I still think is an excellent paper, wasn't published, that we just pulled it out of the report, but we had cited it incorrectly. And it's an example of what you should do. If you make a mistake, you should fix it. And I think that in the end, the typo in the table is something that the people that did the calculations probably should have figured out.
I wish I could think of such a simple mistake that I can claim was my biggest. Kevin, thank you so much. It's an amazing display, really. It's just... Thanks for all you're doing. Thanks for your candid remarks. So, yeah.
Thanks also to John Taylor for moderating the discussion. And then one final round of thank yous. Thanks to all of you for spending the day with us here today, to our sponsors, Heidrick & Struggle, Stash, and Dodge & Cox. And thanks especially to the outstanding SIEPR staff who worked incredibly hard throughout the day, led by Ellen Moore, but many other outstanding people. Thanks so much to them. And have a great evening. Hope to see you soon at another SIEPR event. Enjoy the weekend.